So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Erin Wallace. I'm a scientist here with the program. And this afternoon, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Puckett, who's from the United States. Would you like to share with the group a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I am Robert. I come to you guys from Texas, where I'm employed at a university there as an associate professor and extension entomologist. That's Texas A&M University. And so we do a lot of work on invasive insect pests, including the red imported fire ant. I've been working on that ant for close to 25 years now. And so our university has been involved in all of sort of the decisions up to and until the point when we abandoned our eradication attempts because our country had failed to stop the spread of red imported fire ants. But we continue to do research for homeowners, property owners, and the pesticide manufacturing industry to help folks understand how best to mitigate fire ant issues on a property by property basis. We don't have any sort of government intervention in our fire ant management efforts any longer. Yeah. So that's it in a nutshell.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this morning we went out to Eagleby to one of our science experiment sites, and we got to show Robert what the situation is like for us here, particularly in the suppression area. The densities of nests that we saw were quite similar. Robert was telling us to what he's experienced in Texas. So one of the things that we were talking about is the importance of what we're doing here and the fact that we actually do have a chance of eradicating. So something I think that is really important for our staff to know is the importance of what they do when they're putting bait on the ground.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I was sort of disheartened when I saw the mound density, because I even said aloud in the truck, it looked like home when we came over a hill. And I think you noticed me react to that. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I was here in 2017 and I didn't see densities like that. But that's to be expected. I mean, we were inside the containment zone, not the eradication zone. And so, what you guys are doing inside those areas and in the eradication zone, what you are doing is vitally important. As Erin said, you do have a shot at this. I'm still hopeful that you guys can pull this off, although it's a whale of an effort. I kind of run down, why we failed to eradicate red imported fire ants. I don't know how many of your personnel might know this story from,
Some of them are very new, so not all of them will have heard it. Yeah,
so we had a very similar situation as yours, and I would encourage all of you. I did it for the first time on my way down. I obtained a copy of a book called The Fire Ant Wars. And it's actually a dissertation that was published, a bit of a political historian at University of Pennsylvania, and he dug into and researched our history with red imported fire ants from the time they came into the 1930s of the last century, of course. So when those ants arrived, they began to spread around the area around Mobile, Alabama. It wasn't until the end, I mean, we became busy with the Second World War shortly after their introduction. It wasn't until the conclusion of that campaign that we turned our attention to dealing with red imported fire ants. And we did essentially exactly what you guys are doing. We delimited the expansion of fire ants in the southern United States, and we worked from the outside. Not we, I'm not that old, but they worked from the outside to the Gulf Coast to try to eradicate their population. Unfortunately, as sophisticated as we were with our chemistry at the time, we selected the wrong approach. We used a contact insecticide dropped from the air, and that killed not only a lot of fire ants, but also all of their competitors. So the next season, when fire ants took to the wing to mate, those that successfully did landed in areas that were devoid of natural enemies. That was it. That was the end of the fight. Although the U.S. continued to put up a bit of a fight for a couple decades after that, but really at the point at which we started applying contact insecticides, the war was lost. And in the intervening time, we have learned that granular baits are the best approach for managing red imported fire ants over large areas, and that's what you guys are doing. And it's if we could go back in time and do what you're doing, I think we could have been successful, but obviously not the way we approached it. And in fact, I've told this story since I've been in your country that we received a grant to work on a new invasive species of ant, new to Texas a few years ago from our state granting agency. And one of the criteria for the grant, the top criteria is that this ant was to impact the lives of most Texans. And the reality is these ants only impacted the lives of a state aquarium in Corpus Christi, Texas, where they occurred. And we thought, we're never going to get this grant. But what we did was included some language to the effect of, well, wouldn't you like to be the granting agency, considering granting money to do research on an ant in 1935 that occurred in only like 4 blocks in Mobile, Alabama, called the red imported fire ant, and they funded it immediately. That's how strongly we feel about this ant and how frustrated we are that we have to live with these into perpetuity for the rest of our lives, for the rest of my children and probably their children's lives if we don't find a new technology to attempt to eradicate our ants, which I don't imagine we will. We will spend billions of dollars in our system. We spend almost $10 billion a year treating for fire ants. And also, there's medical costs associated with that. And then, replacement of equipment that they destroy. So we are very hopeful that you guys will be effective in your campaign to rid your country of this ant, because they are awful. They are awful.
Not a good species. One thing that has struck me is the stories that come out of the US about how you guys are dealing with them and the impacts that they're having on you. So a lot of our staff at the moment, particularly, they're in the periphery area treating where there's a very low density of nests. So a lot of our communities out there with, I'm sure that anyone who's listening today would be able to attest to this, and you've experienced it yourself, is that a lot of people are unaware of what the impacts are like on lifestyle and native species and that sort of stuff. So could you give us a bit of insight into what life is like in Texas with fire ants as a regular?
Yeah, so it's interesting when somebody asks me this, because I am part of a generation, and those after me will also sort of fall into this set of people that go cradle to grave with red imported fire ants. They're sort of part of our consciousness all the time. So I guess one place to start is to talk about their impacts on other invertebrate communities. So they have extirpated many of our most important ant species. Well, some of our most important ant species in the state, one of which provides the food resources to our state reptile, the horned lizard. So the harvester ants in our state that we grew up catching as the fire ants began to fill in the gaps across the state. We would collect these ants, but also the lizards that they supported. They're no longer in our portion of Texas. They're threatened now, as a matter of fact, because of the inability of the harvester ants to compete with red imported fire ants. And then, of course, you've got all sorts of other invertebrate communities that have been impacted by red imported fire ants, all the way up through the vertebrates. So we have ground nesting birds that, they only occur now in the areas of our state outside of the red imported fire ant expansion zone, which is roughly 2/3 of our state. And then, of course, you will lose countrymen as a result of these ants. And I feel perfectly confident making that prediction. I'm actually surprised it hasn't happened already. You will lose people. And if you're a parent, you can only imagine, and especially if you've seen these ants, those of you that have experienced them, now imagine when your child tumbles into a colony for the first time and they're stung from head to toe, and then you have to spend those nervous minutes wondering how allergic they may be. And so every person in my part of the world can share that story. Every parent, I should say, can share the story of when their child first found their way into a fire ant colony. It's awful. So yeah. And then just in terms of sort of, your backyard barbecues, backyard weddings, these sorts of things, you constantly have to think about the management of these ants on your property. And, there are situations where people who have larger properties have to manage them for fear of litigation from somebody maybe traipsing through the yard and being stung. This happens. They get into our air conditioners, outdoor air conditioner equipment, and they'll short out your air conditioner. So the air conditioner repair industry in our state just thrives on this matter. They've only gotten ours once. I'm pretty good at controlling these in our yard, but it happened this year. We had some trouble with an air conditioner, and I thought, yeah, so it was early in the morning, so I just went ahead and made a call to our repair people, and My wife was home that day and she called me about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She said, they finally got you. So anyway, that was about a $300 fee to resolve that. But yeah, so they're just awful. They affect basically every aspect of outdoor life during the warm years in our state. Oh, the other thing, those of you that mow your yard, now imagine maybe you've already done this already. I don't know. Have you ever run a mower over a mound that you didn't notice?
Not personally.
And they went flying out in all different directions. This is a negative experience for mowers, and mowing crews. So anyway, we kind of joke about it. We've got sort of a macabre sense of humor about them. You can come to our Fire Ant Festival in Marshall, Texas in October of the year every year and celebrate them there. You can drink fire ant beers and Mississippi red ales, and all this kind of nonsense.
At least you've embraced the downside.
Yeah,
of
you
having
gotta live with them.
It's one of those situations you either laugh or you cry.
But we would prefer not to laugh and live with them.
Yeah.
What I want you guys out there in the field to understand how important your work is to your countrymen. If you can solve this, I mean, it's kind of a moonshot, but you've got a good plan. You've got good products, and I think this can be done. But it's going to take loads of work, as you know. You're coming into a warm season. You're going to be sweating every day working on these guys. I promise you, if it works, it will all have been worth it.
100% agree. Something that I know we get questioned a lot, both when we're in the field and people that call into the program, reporting fire ants. They're very concerned about the treatment products that we use and the relative toxicity to non-target ant species, pets, people. I think there's a lot of concern that the treatment is actually worse than the fire ants. So we've been building messaging around how we communicate that out. You've mentioned a lot today that Texans see the insect growth regulator as the most environmentally friendly treatment option. Can you talk a little bit more on the treatment products that you guys use?
Yeah, so despite what you guys may have heard about us in Texas and the southern U.S., we are environmentally concerned about using insecticides in our systems. And we have become very, very comfortable over the decades in using not only growth regulators. I mean, most folks keep fire ant, well, in the fire ant range in the U.S., most folks keep fire ant baits. People like me that don't keep another insecticide in our homes, we keep fire ant baits and liquid baits for sugar feeding ants that come indoors. But that's about it. But we use like Advion and and other products that have not only a nerve toxin but also a growth regulator. So those of us that use granular baits, we tend to think of growth regulator products as being the least toxic approach.
Yeah.
And we've become very comfortable with that over the years. We understand. If there were mounting environmental concerns about these baits, I mean, we have the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, and they would be all over this. We don't see this, and so it's surprising. Some of the push. I mean, from my perspective, from my experience with baits, it's a bit surprising when I've heard from folks in your country that are very concerned about this. On the other hand, I also know this is new, and we're talking about applying toxic materials.
Yeah.
To their property. So I get it. And hopefully you guys do too. There should be concern about this. From the perspective, well, what I mean to say is if there were no concern from your countrymen, I think, what's wrong with these people? We're talking about applying an insecticide to kill animals. But fire ant baits tend to be very targeted to those insects. We don't experience a lot of non-target impacts of either ants or other invertebrates because of the use of granular bait insecticides in our system.
Yeah.
We just don't.
I think that's fantastic to know that like the biggest impact that you would have is to other ant species. Right. And even then you're not seeing too great of an impact. Yeah.
So if you think about, I mean, we sort of, scratch our heads and say, well, why is this? I mean, after all, we are putting granular bait on the ground that other ants could pick up. Yep. So why don't we see a lot of non-target impacts to other ant species? Well, if you think about how successful fire ants have been in invading not only your country, ours, South Korea, Japan, most recent, let's see, who am I missing? China, most recently in Italy, in Europe, right? So when they do, they expand their range, as you have seen, to the exploitation of other ant species in those systems. So how do they do that? Well, they just outcompete them. Their foraging intensity is just remarkable. So if you provide a food lure to fire ants with neighboring other species of ants in the neighboring system, it's typically fire ants that are able to gain purchase of those baits, what they perceive to be a food resource, and defend it from other ant species. At least that's what we see in our system. Now, I have to say, I don't know all of your ants, and hopefully people are studying those interactions between your native species and fire ants, determining that it is the same here as in the U.S. But I would guess that it is largely so.
Yeah, and for those playing at home, the science team does do regular investigations into what the bait is doing to our native ant communities. So in the research that we're doing at the moment, we're doing regular pitfall trapping just to see what is happening to those native communities, both whilst they're under treatment and also after treatment ceases. What we've seen every time we've done this sort of work is that the native ant communities do rebound very quickly after we finish that treatment. And without the fire ants there competing with them, those native ants actually have a better chance of reestablishing en masse.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and so and also, if you think about an eradication program as it moves, fairly quickly across the landscape as you guys shrink the invasion zone, the native ants that are outside of it right now are going to move in to occupy that space.
Yep.
The old quote, nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Yes.
If there's a vacuum left behind, it's going to be your native ants
fill
that
it.
fill it.
Yep.
So yeah, as it stands now, I don't have a great deal of concern about your native ants as a result of the application of granular baits.
Yep.
I have a great deal of concern about your native ants as they compete with red imported fire ants. It's one of these decisions you guys have to make. They're going to impact plants and animals, and that goes for invertebrates and vertebrates in your system if they're allowed to proliferate.
Yeah.
And different from our system is the fact that, these ants are a southern phenomenon in the United States. They have expanded to all the territories that will support them biologically. Like they're done expanding in our state unless the temperature continues to rise. But in your country, the habitat suitability mapping suggests that they could expand to 95% of the land mass, and it would support their population.
Yeah.
This is a totally different scenario than the United States. Even if we wanted to eradicate now, it would take the finances of the whole country, and of course, the northern United States would just completely object to the idea of this, right? That this is now a southern problem where we are. This is going to be an Australian problem where you guys are, if they're allowed to break containment. And again, that's why it's so important that you guys succeed with this effort. And the work that you're doing is vitally important to your country and its natural resources. Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to come back to, we did mention the density in the suppression area and what's happening in that area earlier in the conversation. And we discussed in some of our conversations earlier today that some of the strategies that we're looking into in that area is to be applying a strategy called skip swath, which is basically you treat a run, you miss a run, you treat a run. So you're essentially treating 50% of your land mass. What's your opinion on using that and its ability to suppress a population?
Well, especially in the suppression zone, right? We wouldn't want to do
not
this
in the eradication zone. No.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I told Erin this morning, she used the term skip swath. And there aren't many people that are here in my country talking about this, but sort of my predecessor at Texas A&M, Dr. Bart Dries, developed these ideas. And I remember him trialing it in the US, and there's papers out if you guys want to go read it. It was very, very effective. But at the time, folks were already used to broadcasting across their home environment or their properties where they treated for fire ants. So that was a hard message to get across. And they thought, well, why? We're already doing this. We don't see any problems with it. Cool, let's move on. Bart will be so excited to know that somebody's talking about using this method. But yeah, it was very, very effective as long as your swaths are not greater than the distance of the foraging of the ants that occur in the untreated areas. That's the key. But yeah, I think it's a very valid method.
Yeah.
For suppression.
Be exciting to try and be able to communicate whether we've had success with it to you guys.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear.
You mentioned earlier something, it's one of my favorite topics is the pseudaction fly or the forward fly colloquially. It's one of those gross organisms that preys on something else. I'm very excited about it. We've often said that the effects that it would have on a colony level wouldn't be enough to really sustain active suppression, but that it does have benefits to what we're doing. Something I was curious about, which we discussed earlier as well, was how those phorids hone in on their target and what information we might be able to extract to use in other technologies.
Yeah. So for those of you who are unaware of what Erin's discussing, so in the U.S., we have introduced some natural enemies from the native system in South America, because it's very important to understand where we are. Like if you think of Texas, if you could see a human density map, you would see most of our human density occurs in like Houston, San Antonio, up to Austin, Waco, Dallas, Fort Worth, and El Paso. But it's the large expanse of agricultural lands where nobody's treating. Homeowners on ranches, they'll treat around the area around their home, but that's it. And you may be thinking of talking about 1,000 acres, and then a quarter acre gets treated around the house. So that becomes our source population of fire ants. And those of us in the city, as they fly in, we become the sink population. So we treat them with baits and move on that season, or we have to do it a couple times over the year, and then we start again the next year as more ants fly into the city. So the idea was, if we could find a natural enemy from the native system and release them into ours, maybe they could impact fire ants out in the rural and agricultural environments. And so that's the fly that Erin's talking about. They belong to a family called Phoridae. It's a huge family of flies, but there's a genus called Pseudactyon, and there's 25 or so species in South America that impact red imported fire ants. And so we have, I think, 6 in place now. There were 2 that were released during my PhD work, and that's actually what I worked on, the interaction between these flies and their ant hosts. As we watch the flies spread around our state in the southern U.S., very satisfying. So they hone in on the pheromones that are released from fire ants in a variety of different activities that they engage in. So if there's one species that's released, Pseudactyon tricuspis, that is sort of a disturbance specialist. So if a fire ant colony gets disturbed, of course, there's defensive pheromones that are released. Those drift away from the colony. If there's flies around, they pick up on that and follow the plume back to the colony and then start attacking. Pseudactyon curvatus, for instance, is a foraging trail specialist. So as they're laying foraging trail and recruiting nestmates to food resource that they've discovered, the flies will show up and attack them. And by attack, I mean they use an oviposition, an egg layer, to inject an egg through the exoskeleton of the fire ant. And now it has an egg inside, which hatches soon thereafter, usually within 24 hours. Now they've got a maggot inside that's growing. Well, the ant does ant stuff. It doesn't know it's parasitized for a few days, until which time the maggot crawls through the constriction between the head and the thorax. It's growing. It's got to get through there before it gets too big to do so. Once it gets into the head capsule, it starts feeding on tissue, including the brain, and that kills the ant. And then they also release an enzyme that breaks down the tissue that keeps the ant head connected to the body, and the head falls off with the larvae, and then they pupate inside the ant head, and about a month later, they wiggle out and start all over. And I'm telling you, Erin, so I give these talks to homeowners and homeowners associations and property managers, and they might nod and snooze through a lot of this. I have a video of Pseudactyon fire ants attacking, Pseudactyon phorid flies attacking fire ants, and they go nuts. It's like they're watching the Super Bowl in our state. Like everybody loves watching this video because it's so satisfying. People have lived with these. So they're a really cool fly, parasite and host interaction story. But unfortunately, they've spread throughout the fire ant range in the U.S. Unfortunately, nobody has any data that they can point to suggest that they're having a population regulatory impact.
Yeah.
But we're hopeful that given time they'll be. And it's not a 1-for-1 parasite host replacement story, biocontrol story. The idea is that they undercut their foraging intensity. See, the ants flee when they recognize the flies have found them.
Yes.
And they go into their colony. So the idea is if you get these into the system, then you undermine their foraging intensity with the idea that our native ants might then be able to build up their population densities to overcome red imported fire ants. We'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
I'm also aware that there's been a bit of research done with natural enemies in terms of viruses and microbes. And I've read some of David Oy's papers on using the combination of the 3 approaches, and that's had quite a decent impact in certain areas. So something for everybody out there in fire ant land. We are looking at what sorts of natural enemies we can utilize. First steps that we're interested in looking at is actually finding out from our ants whether we actually have any viruses that they've brought in themselves. That would be really important as well. If they have, depending on what virus it is, it can have an antagonistic effect on the insect growth regulator. That's correct, right? Yeah. So the presence of that virus may actually be undermining our treatment success. So for us to learn that and understand it better will be critical moving forward as well.
Just again, I do hope you know that those of us that know about this situation and are interested in it from the United States are watching very closely, and we're very, very hopeful that you can solve this issue for your country. The work you're doing is very, very important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Amazing. Oh, yeah, there's one question.
That's a good question.
Yep. So are there any new treatments or baits being trialed in the US for fire ants?
Oh yeah. So we trial new baits and treatments all the time. In fact, I can't call the name, but there is a new active ingredient that has us quite excited. But yeah, so we spend a lot of time. So I've got a trial that will be starting as soon as I get back to College Station. I've got a new graduate student that may or may not know that he's going to be involved in this when I get back outside of his master's thesis research. So yeah, our students around the lab get incorporated in these projects. It's nice because it allows them to meet with folks in industry and this sort of thing. But we do a lot of this. We have to, in our country, to be able to sell a product with a synthetic active ingredient, it has to be registered through the Environmental Protection Agency. Yeah. And of course, they need third-party testing to validate the claims of the company. And that's where we and other universities come in. So we do a lot of that. We constantly trial fire ant products. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
I've got one more coming in. So just to confirm, the 10 billion is that spent on, so the 10 billion in pesticides, is that spent just in Texas or is that throughout the rest of the US?
Okay, so that is throughout the range of fire ants in the US, the entirety of that range. And to be clear, that's not just for pesticides. Pesticides make up a sizable budget, right? But but keep in mind, again, that is property owner expenditure. So people go to the big box stores or they order them online, your version of Bunnings in the US, or they order online, and then they apply those products. And we hope that they apply them properly. And we know that they don't always. So my father loves the yard to look like it snowed after he's put out granular baits, you know. You don't have to do that. You can apply a proper application rate. But yeah, so that's a small portion of the expenditure. The other portions are like things like replacement. So the air conditioner costs that I mentioned, replacing destroyed electrical devices. So medical expenses, right? This is a big deal in our country. A lot of people are allergic to fire ant stings. So obviously I mentioned we do lose people, but then there are lots of people that end up in hospitals and this sort of thing. So, you know, on golf courses and this sorts of things, they're always dealing with, irrigation equipment that goes down and you name it. They get into everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard horror stories about them getting into traffic lights.
Oh yeah. So and computer systems.
Yep.
So yeah, they're a mess.
Nothing is off limits.
No. Habitat restoration, wildlife restoration, et cetera. All of these costs get summed up, but again, those are annual costs.
Yep.
We will do that every year forever.
Yep.
And you will too, if you don't solve this.
So we've got one more. So what are your thoughts on IGR resistance over time, given our repetitive full-scale treatments? Yeah,
so that's a question that comes up from time to time. And the way I address that is, A, we don't have a lot of evidence that that's developing. B, hopefully you guys are going to move through those zones so that the ants are naive to those treatments. And of course you can rotate in some other products like your, nerve toxins and this sort of thing to mitigate against that. But the reality is, resistance to insecticides does not develop as quickly in social insects as it does in solitary insects. If you are treating the same crop for a row crop pest year after year after year with the same active ingredient, I would be very concerned about resistance. Yeah. We worry about that far less in terms of social insects, because if you think about the queen, you think about your colony as an organism. This is important. Like the queen's maybe like the brains, right? Yeah. And the workers are like the stomach of the colony, and going out foraging. but it's the reproductive unit that we're acting on. This is an individual that may live a dozen years in the field.
Yeah.
This, without treatment, right? This is different from a row crop insect pest that may have 3 generations in a season with all of those opportunities for the genes to sync up properly to provide resistance to those insecticides that are being used. So yeah, we worry a lot less about that in our system with social insects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To add to that, and just so everyone is aware, the science team is actually doing some research at the moment, just to keep an eye on that, just to quantify whether we're seeing bait effects at colony level and how long those effects are lasting. As soon as we've got some data worth sharing, we're going to crash the program webinar and give you a bit of an update on what we're finding. So
awesome.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
One more question?
Yeah. So are there any indigenous South American methods of fire ant population suppression or with fire ant treatment or fire ant treatments that we could emulate here?
Not that I'm aware of. And I would say, the reality is in the native system. So we have these extraordinary densities of fire ants in our country, and they're building within the containment zone as we saw today.
Yeah.
This is unusual in the native system. And this is the case for most invasive plants and animals, right? They usually don't exist in their native system at the densities that they do in invasive systems because they leave their natural enemies behind. When they get to North America, our ants are pretty wimpy compared to the ones that they are competing with in South America, Argentine ants, the tawny crazy ants, and all of these. So you just don't see them at the densities that you do in their invasive range. So folks, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were probably some cultural controls, but maybe not widespread. They may have been, within a village or a city, and that the word of that hasn't spread far and wide. But yeah, I think there's probably far less effort to manage them in the native system than in the invasive systems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a ecosystem balance in the native range. And then when they come to a new territory, it's like, woo, party time.
Right.
So yeah. Yep.
So is there any specialist equipment that everyday people use in their yards to control fire ants, or is it just the granular products really?
Yeah, so I've heard a lot of these discussions since I've been in the country. I've had people ask me about steaming equipment and injection, chemical insecticide injection equipment and all this. Not really, not in the US. Pretty much everybody's abandoned the idea of using specialized equipment for fire ants unless something's not coming to mind because of the efficiency with which we broadcast into our system. And this actually brings up a good point. I can't believe I forgot to mention this earlier. When you inject a colony, inject a mound with a contact insecticide, or if you bait an individual colony because you see it, it's important to understand that you're killing a mound. That's correct. You're killing a colony, but that colony at one time, was so small that you wouldn't see an above ground mound. So we understand that in our country now. Most folks, kind of understand fire ant biology in the South, whether or not they're interested in biology at all. They understand fire ant biology, and they realize that there are likely to be colonies existing in their property that they can't yet see. So most folks just grab a bait and broadcast into their system. And some people will treat individual colonies, and that's fine too, but with the understanding that they're probably going to see a new one pop up somewhere in their yard as it grows and matures. But we would hope that they would kill those colonies before they push out reproductive swarmers. And that's the same for you guys. This is why, broadcasting baits into systems is very important. They're not so much important for the mounds that you can see, but also for the young ones that you cannot see yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, I know we get that a lot from clients is why do you need to treat so much of the land? I know my property, there's no ants there. And I mean, I have a hard time finding small colonies. I'm the one that slows the field teams down when we're out in the field because I'm poking every little tiny mound of dirt. So
so we were over in the Cedar Grove area 2 days ago, and while we were there, we got a call. A woman she had identified a colony in her yard, a mound, right? So we thought, well, we'll hop over and go see. 4 of us fanned out across the yard, and we found, I think 9, maybe it was 7 colonies in addition to the one that she had identified. And these were very young colonies, small. I mean, some of them were mounding just a bit, but we found them and we treated them. But she was unaware. And this was a person who was meticulous about her lawn care and gardening. She didn't know they were there yet, but they were there. And they were coming on. By the end of this season, she would have surely known. She would have seen those mounds. So anyway, broadcasting is a very important part of what we do in our system. And people are sort of tuned to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any other support from state or like government in America or in the US to treat fire ants?
Yeah, but it exists in the form of, so our state legislature, every 2 years, they set aside a couple $1 million. But that is money that we compete for as academics with research proposals. And actually, many years ago, it used to be known as the Red Imported Fire Ant Research and Management Grant. No longer. It's now the Invasive Ant Research and Management Grant, because we keep having new invasive ants invade our system behind fire ants. And so the idea is we want to open this up for people to propose work that would help control some of the other ants that we now have in our system. But yeah, we don't have sort of a pipeline of money coming from the government to solve this. This falls, unfortunately, to the bank accounts of individuals in our country. Yeah.
So we are extraordinarily lucky here that we've got the entire country backing us financially,
yes,
to get this up.
Yes, but I think the appetite for backing that will wane over time, especially if these break containment. So again, the work you're doing is so important, especially the boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And doing it properly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Could you give us a bit of insight to the average density of fire ants per hectare in Texas?
In a suburban area, it's much smaller than out. You get out in pasture land and you could have 120 mounds per acre. Upwards.
And with the increasing density in our suppression zone growing over the next 2 to 3 years, do you see that to be a major hindrance on our eradication efforts in the future?
Yeah, I do, from a number of perspectives. But most importantly, the thing that we're all fearful about is the movement of infested materials from inside that suppression zone outside of the eradication zone. And I believe that's happened once.
It's happened a couple of times.
Oki?
Oki was the one we're talking about.
All right. So yeah, this is greatly concerning for those of us kind of watching your situation from abroad, those of us that are tuned in. Yeah, all it takes is one truckload of agricultural or products or mulch or turf grass, as we've been discussing. And we have these same issues in our part of the world, although the temperature's a little lower in terms of the movement of those goods outside of our quarantine zone. Because as I said earlier, our fire ants have essentially expanded to the areas that they can, right? Yeah. But be that as it may, we do pay attention to this. But in your country, if that happens, this could be game over, right? If they get over the range, that's that, and then you're in the whack-a-mole game again, right? Hoping to knock them down as they're found, right? But let's imagine a wilderness area where nobody's looking, and you get a very large, expansive population there. And at that point, I think the support would probably get rolled up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There is an end point for everything.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
Yeah.
And I would say, I hate it, but I think you guys are just on the precipice of falling over that. So, keep up the work that you're doing, and hopefully you can demonstrate some shrinkage of the eradication zone.
Yeah.
Most importantly.
That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
And just following on from that, are there any carrier movement controls in the US?
Yeah, to some degree. So like in our state, if you look at a map of the state of Texas, if you know the Panhandle region, that's sort of the sort of angular rectangular area up in the north, we don't have fire ants there. And so our state agency works to keep goods from moving to those areas that have fire ants, although we understand that they're probably not going to be able to establish there and expand. Still, there's a perfect example of a city called Lubbock, Texas, that's 200 miles from the expansion zone. And the ants are thriving in the cities there, right, where the habitat is maintained for them, up against buildings, not out at the edges of yards, because it's very cold there in the winter. But everybody's running their heater in their homes, and there's enough radiant heat that allows those populations to survive, and we don't want that. So yeah, the state does watch for that. But yeah, there's not great interest, although I guess out in the western United States where the gaps are being filled in, but that's sort of out in California and Nevada, and I don't really know what they do to surveil for the importation of fire ants. But yeah.
One thing that we are lucky we have here is the efforts of our community and engagement team and how well they communicate with members of the public, and the system we have to get people reporting in. So they send a lot of photos in to us.
Yeah.
Everybody has a phone in their pocket these days, despite the fact that my maths teacher told me I'd never have a calculator in my pocket. Now I do.
You do.
similar to cameras, so people can take a photo of a suspect ant and send it through to the program for assessment. We've found that really, really powerful, and a lot of our major detections outside of the area have actually come in through client reports. Yeah, so it's been a really key feature in what we do, and helping us to get on top of these incursions when they're still young enough to get rid of.
That's right.
So yeah, that's been brilliant, and
Good.
huge kudos to our team for getting out there and get the messaging out.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
So when's the best time of year to treat using granular base to maximize the treatment of small non-visible nests?
Yeah, so well, I'll speak in terms of seasons because I'm not exactly sure your seasons in relation to our months, right? But so what we often tell people is you go into fall, if you live in an area, well, most of our state, with red imported fire ants, treat as temperatures are starting to fall. So we're in the sort of the oppressive heat portion of our year. But as we move into like October, just before our fall starts, we recommend people lay down either granular baits or in some cases contact insecticide granules. So what's happening is as winter comes on, those ants have taken the bait, over the first couple of days of application, and they're dying over the course of the winter. Then as spring comes on, you can watch your yard and see what pops up. And if you have 1 or 2 colonies that pop up, you likely killed all the incipient and even some of the mature colonies, and you can go and treat those individually and just sort of see how the spring and summer comes on after that. Yeah.
Cool. One of the things that we use in the science team is the research that's come out of America about when you treat the life cycle of the ant and what is being produced in a colony at what time of the year.
Yeah.
And we're translating that into the Australian situation to better plan how we're putting treatment down.
Well, I think that will be important for your effort, but the reality is we're not too fussy about it, we're just waiting all the time. Fortunately.
Yes, and we feel your pain, and hopefully we will be able to win the war over here.
Yeah, well, yeah, we feel your pain, and hopefully you will. Hey, I do want to take a minute and just thank several groups that have sponsored my trip over. I want you guys to know that this is, I'm here first and foremost to speak at AEPMA, the Australian Environmental Pest Managers Association, last week, to train pest managers about how we treat these fire ants. And so they were helped sponsor a portion of my trip, as did Syngenta, as well as Invasive Species Council. So I'm very grateful for their support of my trip over. And I hope that they will feel as though they got something out of this. I hope I can help you guys to one degree or another. And if nothing more, just establishing a contact, somebody that lives with these ants. I gave you my email and I mean it. I hope you'll reach out if you have questions that your team can't answer, or, if something comes up and something looks funky to you, just shoot us a message. I'll be happy to help as best I can.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I also am very grateful for the fact that you're here and we've got to spend so much time together today.
Yeah, every day, huh?
Yeah, learn from each other. So it's been fantastic.
Yep. Thank you.
Awesome. Well,
good luck, guys.
End it there. And thanks everyone for joining us. You're all doing amazing work. Keep up the incredible work out there. And we will talk to you soon.